Hi, welcome to the National Maritime Museum for the second of our series, A Nice Cuppa. Thank you for zooming in with us this evening. Relax, and I guess now would be probably a good time to put the kettle on and have a comforting and refreshing cup of your favorite beverage. So, milk and sugar, one lump or two, strong or weak. In the UK, we love a good brew pretty much any time of the day. So how did a nice cuppa become so popular and how did it get here? Well, last week we discovered all about the plant itself, excuse me, so we know what tea is. But what about its history? Today we're going to explore how tea arrived on these shores, who introduced it, and the shady moves to get it. This is the story, you could say, of empire, marketing, colonialism, intrigue, and cultural appropriation. To help us with this, we are joined by Louise Macfarlane, Curator of Research and Information at the Royal Museums Greenwich, and also Robert Blyth. He's the Senior Curator of World and Maritime History at the National Maritime Museum. Thank you both for joining us this evening. Lovely to see you. Have we got Robert there?
Yes, indeed.
Yes, we got, right, didn't see you, sorry. Let me start actually by asking you both if you are partial to a nice cuppa yourselves, and how do you like yours? Who wants to go first?
I'm having a mug of tea now, although I might not be able to drink it all whilst we're doing this. So I like mine quite strong with a dash of milk, no sugar.
No sugar, right. And any preference for the actual tea, or is it like builder's breakfast tea?
Builder's breakfast.
Right. And yourself, Louise?
I'd be the same, actually. Yeah, absolutely. It's just a sort of bog standard English breakfast, quite strong, dash of milk. Tea bag in first, quite particular about this. Milk once the tea bag is out. And yeah, no sugar for me.
I'm always kind of surprised by actually friends who love their cup of tea but don't have a teapot, and so they just do it in their mug. To me, it gets too strong really quickly. Do you have a preference on that, or you just go straight to the mug?
Straight to the mug.
Straight to the mug for me as well, yeah.
Right. Okay. I'm kind of a weak tea person myself. Robert, if I can start with you. So let's go back to the 17th century when the British East India Company had a monopoly on importing goods from outside Europe. Firstly, who exactly were the British East India Company? Who were they trading with, and when did they first start bringing tea to the UK? So sorry, there's three questions there.
Yeah.
Who were the British East India Company?
Okay, so the East India Company was founded by Royal Charter by Elizabeth I in 1600. It had the monopoly on British trade with Asia via the Cape of Good Hope. And pretty quickly, they moved from being essentially a spice merchant, trading principally pepper from the Spice Islands, but the Dutch were there and they sort of pushed the English East India Company out, and the company began trading textiles from India and eventually began in the 17th century to import tea, which was this sort of new strange drink / medicine from China, and that began essentially the British love affair with tea.
Okay, so I think we have a picture of from our collection of some of East India men. Quite a good picture here, I think. Yes, and so these guys, who were the guys on board? Were they just sailors? How did they recruit them?
So they would be merchant seamen who were looking for essentially steady work, and the East India Company did offer, quite good work. Of course, it's a long voyage out to the Far East if you're trading with China. So, it might be a year there and back potentially, depending on what time that you're traveling at. The captain of an East India Company ship was allowed to do some private trade. so he could enhance his income through a bit of trade on the side. So he might be importing specialist materials for particular customers back into Britain, and at the same time exporting things that he knew the Chinese would readily want to buy.
Okay. I like the expressions on these guys' faces. They don't look particularly happy there, or maybe they're just making a face. But I was going to say about China at that stage were very much in charge of how they negotiated the trade. And they, rightly so, guarded the tea crop and the warehouses. So what were they getting in exchange, or what was happening there in the trade-off?
So for most of the time that the East India Company is trading, Europeans can only trade from Canton, what's now called Guangzhou in China. So you would arrive with your ship at a place called Whampoa Island, where you would be met by the Chinese, and you would be taken to what was called the British factory. So this isn't actually somewhere that's producing anything. It's more like essentially a business office that's on the quayside at Canton. And what would happen there is that Chinese merchants would come to the factory to trade. You didn't go out into China to strike a deal. And essentially, the Chinese want silver in exchange for tea, much to the frustration of the British, who are determined that the Chinese should, be keen on, I don't know, iron buckets from Birmingham or whatever else the Industrial Revolution is producing. But no, the Chinese, silver only.
Silver only. So what was the British reaction to this and how did they get around it?
Well, of course, the British sent out endless diplomatic missions to try and persuade the emperor to essentially change his mind. And, the emperor gets showered with gifts of, musical clocks and, automata, all these sorts of things, which he says are very nice, but he won't be persuaded. So by the late 18th century, as tea has become much more popular in Britain, it's become an important part of the company's trade. So they need to find a way to get round this Chinese obsession with only using silver. And at that point, what they do is something very clever, quite complicated, and highly illegal. And that is that they begin to license the growing of opium in India, which is then smuggled to China, where the smugglers sell it to Chinese opium dealers for silver. Now, this is the complicated bit. So, everyone listening may find themselves drifting off now. But what happens is that the East India Company taxes the export of opium. So those people who are smuggling it round pay their taxes with some of the Chinese silver. So when the East India Company sails from India round to China to pick up the next load of tea, it can pay for the tea with Chinese silver that's been taxed as part of the opium trade. So very clever, but also highly illegal, because opium trading was against the law in China.
Right, because I was thinking, like, where were the British getting their silver from to pay the Chinese in the first place? Because it's not natural to hear. It's how was that happening?
Well, often the British silver would be sort of prizes of war. During the 18th century, Britain is quite frequently at war with France and also with Spain. So it might intercept treasure ships that are coming particularly from South America, and silver would be part of that. There would also just be silver that was in general circulation as part of currency and bullion for trade. But what the British worried about was that you were actually essentially sending silver, something with a known value, over to China, where you were exchanging it for this strange dried leaf that you were essentially just going to put boiled water on, and through biological function, you would eventually flush away. So for the British in the 18th century, the tea trade was the equivalent of throwing silver down the toilet, essentially.
Right, right. We have a picture here, a portrait at least, of an East India Company captain. Can you tell us much about him? He's obviously very proud of, he's pointing to the ship there, like, that's mine, I'm captain.
Yeah, so I mean, we don't know who this man is, which is, you know, very annoying. But he's wearing his East India Company uniform, and he's rightly pointing to one of the ships he will have captained. And what the East India Company is doing is essentially, you know, bringing in quite significant quantities of things like tea, but also cotton as well. And by importing in bulk, it begins to drive the price of tea down. So actually what the company is doing is expanding the market for the tea it's importing, so actually boosting its business. And a successful captain will make a fortune through not just his wages, because they weren't particularly good, but as I mentioned, from the trade he would be able to do on the side. So you wouldn't need to stay a company captain necessarily for a very long time, because you might, you know, end up with a fortune and be able to enjoy an early retirement and a nice cup of tea.
Lovely. So yeah, quite rightly, he looks very smart. I mean, they're quite dapper, these East India guys. It was a massive company. How was that related to the sort of government? Because that was a private affair, the actual company?
Yes, so the company is essentially a private organization, but it gets very large. And if we remember the financial crash, I think it would be fair to say that the East India Company was deemed too big to fail. So it actually had quite a close relationship with the government, occasionally lending the government money and occasionally getting money from the government. But the relationship with the government was also tied into trade as well, because obviously the government benefited from the import of tea because tea was taxed. There was an import duty on tea. Right.
So getting back to the opium, the start of the Opium Wars, I guess, and you've just mentioned that before. Where was it grown? How did it become, you know, how did the actual war start?
Well, there are two things. By 1833, the company has actually lost its trading monopolies. So what we've now got is essentially a private free-for-all on trade with China. So those old systems and certainties that the East India Company had managed to keep in place were swept away after 1833. And by 1839, so within the space of just 6 years, Britain and China were at war. What had happened was that the Chinese emperor was essentially fed up with the enormous social impact that opium was having on China. There was mass addiction along the seaboard because of the huge imports. And opium smoking makes people listless. They essentially smoke the opium and then largely go to sleep. So it was having a real impact. So what happened was that they confiscated all of the British opium at Canton and destroyed it as an indication that this is illegal, you're actually going to stop. And initially, the British government said, well, tough opium traders, you're actually breaking the law, so you can't expect us to intervene on your behalf. But eventually, lobbying by the opium people and the idea that somehow British interests were being damaged eventually changed the mind of the British government, and ships and troops were sent to essentially make the Chinese surrender.
What sort of date would that have been?
So this is the first Opium War is 1839 to 1842. And at the end of the Opium War, the Treaty of Nankin is signed.
Mhm.
And what this allows is it grants Hong Kong to Britain. It also frees up extra ports, so it's not just Canton that can be traded from, and it gives the British in China greater rights. So essentially it's what's called an unequal treaty.
Yeah.
So it's really in Britain's favor, and is actually forcing the Chinese to begin to open up that big Chinese market.
Right. So that brings us to the stealing of seeds, and I guess we're talking about imperial greed and espionage, even on a grand scale. They could make like great Netflix out of this. So who was Robert Fortune, and what was his part in all of the espionage sort of story?
Well, it's a good name.
Yeah, it's a great name.
Yeah.
For him.
But Robert Fortune was actually a Scottish botanist. So in the immediate aftermath of the First Opium War, he went out to China and actually disguised himself as a Chinese merchant and broke the law. The unequal treaties allowed you to travel as far as you could in a day from the treaty port, but no further. But disguised, Fortune went much further and, of course, began to learn about tea, so its cultivation and actually what a tea plant looks like. So it's a camellia bush. What he eventually did through journeys in the 40s and 50s was that he collected plants and seeds and took them back to India and tried to cultivate Chinese tea in northern India. Well, that was actually a misfortune because it didn't really work. But with his knowledge of what tea was and how to cultivate it, he realized that tea was already growing in plain sight in northern India, so began to cultivate the local variety, and that's now what we know as Assam tea today.
What about the Americans and Dutch? Were they getting in on the act, or was that just Robert Fortune?
No. Well, I mean, other people are keen to get in on the tea trade, as it were. But of course, what Britain had was an imperial possession in India, which actually gave them somewhere to cultivate the tea, and that proved eventually immensely successful. And it was also a type of tea that the British preferred. It was builder's brew.
Right, the very one. So they figured out how to grow it and grew it, and then they dominated the market from like the late 1800s to the 1930s.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, Britain became an absolutely key part of the tea trade, introducing new blends, and then of course you get different companies becoming involved, the sort of high street names that we would recognize today.
So what happened to the East India Company? They lost their monopoly. It came to an end. What happened to then? Who was bringing in the tea after that?
Well, after that, it's essentially private companies and private individuals who are doing it. And the net result is, of course, that trade with China booms after the East India Company because people are out to make their fortune.
Right. Was there like I think you mentioned before to me about that the money or the taxes on the tea paid for the Navy?
Yeah, so by the beginning of the 19th century, about 10% of the government's revenue came from the duties paid on tea. Now, that was effectively enough to pay for the Royal Navy. So you can see what a close connection there is between this long distance trade and the finances of the British government.
Right, yeah. What about the smuggling? Because that happened as well. Could you tell us a bit about smuggling tea?
Well, you know, like everyone else, governments can get a bit greedy as well. So if you put the tax on tea up too high, then people begin to think, well, actually, smuggling tea could prove quite lucrative. So what would happen is that, you know, an East India Company ship might find itself unfortunately delayed off the coast, and a small boat might row out, and, you know, a few crates of tea which were spoilt in the voyage might find their way into the boat, and they would be taken back to shore and essentially sold on through the smuggling network. And that was true of, you know, say the trade in alcohol and other commodities as well. And eventually what the government realizes is that there has to be a balance. So actually lowering the tea duty might actually get rid of smuggling, because it doesn't have the same differential in price that makes the smuggling worthwhile.
Right. Then coming to like, it was expensive, it was a rarity, even though there was a lot coming in, but only certain people got the tea because of the price. So it was very expensive. So was it exclusively the preserve of the upper middle classes?
Well, when it first arrives, it's terrifically expensive, and is something that actually only aristocrats would be dealing with. But what the aristocracy does, of course, is what the middle class wants to emulate. So eventually, you know, as the price of tea begins to just fall a little, it can come out to the middle class, and then it begins to become more and more popular and moves down the social scale. So by the beginning of the 19th century, you know, tea is being consumed by quite a wide range of society. I mean, by the end of the 19th century, tea has emphatically become the national drink. I mean, it is simply what everyone is consuming.
Okay, great stuff. Thank you. If we move over to think about the types of ship that were bringing in the tea. So we had large ships, and then what happened, if maybe Louise, when did we first start to see the, gives you a chance to have your cup of tea there, Robert. When did we first start to see the design of the clipper ships, and how were they better at carrying tea?
Well, clipper ships were pioneered in the United States at the beginning of the 19th century, and they weren't any better at carrying tea than any other sort of ship. The key thing was that clipper ships were fast. Their design was all about being fast. So they had three main design characteristics, which were a long, narrow hull, a sharp bow at the front of the ship, which would enable the ship to cut through the waves rather than bouncing on top, and this huge sail area, raking masts and masses of canvas to really make use of the wind to propel the ship as fast as possible. And what these ships tended to do was prioritize speed over cargo space. So that necessitated that they tended to carry high value cargo like tea. In the 1830s, 1840s, American design was really rocketing forward. There was several imperatives. For instance, the gold rush in California in 1848, that added to this kind of shipping boom, and it also meant that there was a real imperative upon speed. So any kind of advantage you could get, it meant that the American designers were quite bold and innovative because they just needed to get any sort of advantage over their competitors. Whereas really in Britain, the ship design was kind of lagging behind. In 1849, the Navigation Acts were repealed, and these acts had limited British ports to British trade. So the following year, in 1850, the American clipper ship Oriental sailed into London, having made a voyage of just, I think, 95 days out from Hong Kong. And it caused a bit of a sensation. It made the British ship owners realise that they were really kind of lagging behind, and this was the sort of ship that they had to try and compete with. And so that's when really British clipper ships started to take off.
What was essential about the speed? Was it getting things back before anyone else? What sort of propelled that idea that we needed speed?
Yeah, it's as the amount of tea increased, so too did this kind of fashion for having the first of the tea back to London. So it's a kind of strange fashion, because it was a bit of a nonsense, really, because tea is a dry product. It wouldn't matter whether you had the first or the last, really, but it became a real fashion that you had to have the very first that arrived, a bit like Beaujolais Nouveau today, you know. And the tea merchants and ship owners were only too happy to oblige. So basically, they were very keen on getting out to China, getting back to London first, and then you could naturally command the highest prices. To add to that, from 1861, a premium was awarded for the first ships with this first of the season's tea. So there, not only was there a kind of reputational incentive, there was very much a financial one too.
Right. What were the clipper races? So they were racing back, but what kind of events were taking place when they arrived? Because, like you said, it was a big deal and it was quite fashionable. So, yeah, where were they landing and what was happening?
Yeah, I mean, the races, particularly 1866. So 1866 was the real pinnacle of the great tea races. In a way, calling it a race is probably not entirely accurate or fair, because they didn't all start at the same time. Particularly in 1866, they started, different ships started towards the end of May, beginning of June. But the key thing was to get back to London first. And this race in particular, it caught a lot of media interest. So the voyagers were followed throughout their voyage back to England, and commentated on in newspapers that were particularly interested parties. So, for instance, papers in Liverpool, the Glasgow Herald, London Evening Standard, Pall Mall Gazette, papers like these, because these are the places where these ships were from. So there's kind of a vested interest in seeing how these ships were getting on. And there was also a lot of gambling that took place. Lots of people bet high amounts of money on who was going to be the winner, including the crews themselves. I mean, it's suggested that the crews very much took part in betting with their competitors about whether they could beat them or not. And the race was incredibly tight. Basically, it came down to Ariel and Taiping. They sort of were taking over each other, and Fiery Cross was in there as well. And Ariel was the first to actually arrive back on the Thames. But Taiping was the first to secure a tug. So you had to have a sort of motorised boat to help you up the Thames. But Taiping was having to go further up the Thames than Ariel. So basically they're in this constant to and fro, who's going to make it first. Eventually, Taiping manages to unload its cargo just 20 minutes before Ariel. And Taiping is awarded the premium, but sort of behind the scenes, the owners realised that not just these two front runner ships, but all of the other ships who took part in the race. So there were 5 real contenders, but 10 ships who took part in the race overall. They're about to flood the market with tea. So the owners suddenly panicked that perhaps the merchants weren't going to award this premium at all. So they agreed that they wouldn't dispute the exact point at which the winner would be awarded, and they split the premium between them. And actually the premium was never awarded again, but the fashion for speed and competition and racing, that very much continued.
Okay, so when we're talking about speed, like what was the difference between the length of time a clipper ship could get to and back from China to England, and the ones that came before that? the ships that were before that? Was there like how much difference are we talking?
Well, Ariel reached the Kent coast in 99 days, after 99 days out from China. And I think Robert mentioned earlier that it could take a year for the East Indiaman ships, because there was no imperative on speed for the East Indiaman ships. They had been doing the same for practically 2 centuries. They could just pack as much tea as they could in a very large ship and lumber their way back, whereas these smaller, more agile ships were able to carry less, but as a consequence were able to go faster.
Cool. The clipper ships, how long do they actually last for?
Not actually very long. Only their heyday was probably about 30 years, around the middle of the 19th century. But they were then and are now still considered to be the pinnacle of sailing ship design. It's just sort of a bitter irony, perhaps, or poetic license that they sort of coincided with steamships, which would mark their demise.
Oh, okay. So the clipper ships, like the ones you mentioned, the Ariel, and I mean, we know of the Cutty Sark. Who built them? Were they all built elsewhere and imported here, or did the British get the design from the Americans? Where did
they very much took the influence from American design, and there were certainly in the early days, before the Navigation Acts, there were British owners who were commissioning American ships to be built for the China tea trade, because they recognized that British design was kind of lagging behind. But British design sort of it gave its own slant. There was things like the Aberdeen bow, which very much made it a British phenomenon, and they were able to catch up fairly quickly, and they all tended to be designed or owned, should I say, by private owners, as Robert mentioned earlier. So if we're talking about Cutty Sark, for instance, Cutty Sark was owned by a man called John Jock Willis, and his father had established a shipping firm. John Jr. had gone on to be a captain at the tender age of 18, before then working his way up through the ranks and taking over the company that his father had owned. And he had made several attempts to kind of crack the tea market, with sort of limited success. I think he'd had about 7 other ships in the tea trade before Cutty Sark. But Cutty Sark was really his attempt to really crack that market, because, as we've said, there was a lot of money to be made.
Okay, I see we've got a couple of questions which I will feed to Louise and Robert a bit later. But so like, are there any of those companies, those original companies that started up, like you mentioned, Jock Willis, are there any of those companies around today that imported tea back then, or that had those ships, or they're all gone?
That's a very good question. There are certainly tea companies that continue today. I mean, probably the most famous and most obvious example being Twinings, which was established at the beginning of the 18th century. And there are other famous brands that aren't necessarily owned by the original owners, but continue with the name. So, for instance, Tetley and Lipton. But as for ship owners, that's a really good question. I'm not sure. I don't know if Robert has any ideas.
I think there are, some China trading companies that continue today. So something like Jardine Matheson, which you've probably never heard of, but they've certainly been trading in China since the early 1800s, and you are still a trading company today. So they do keep going. But I think Louise is right. It tends to be the brands that survive. So Thomas Twining will have been buying his tea way back in 1706 at auction from the East India Company, as doubtless were Mr. Fortnum and Mr. Mason, who were established the following year. So yeah. Wow,
a long time ago. There's a couple of questions before I carry on. There's one from Tracy George. I guess this is for Robert really. What factors led to the East India Company losing its monopoly, and did they lobby the government to stop free trade?
Oh, absolutely. They lobbied the government to stop free trade. If you're a chartered company with a monopoly, free trade is death. So yeah, they emphatically did. And what happened was that in 1813, the company lost its monopoly on trade with India, but had successfully lobbied to continue the trade with China. But when its charter, the company's charter, came up for renewal 20 years later, political pressure had mounted again, and this time they lost their monopoly on the China trade. So essentially they were a trading company that could no longer trade. So by that stage, they were essentially the government of India.
Okay. Right. There's one from, thank you, from Ravel here. He says, apparently Cook's last voyage was organized by the Navy to find a shorter rumored North Passage through North America to reach China faster. The prime motive being tea trade. As we know, the voyage ended in tragedy and the North Passage was never found. Can you tell us more about what happened after Resolution voyage, and if more attempts were made by British government to find the infamous passage?
Yep. So the idea is that if you could get your China trade going essentially across the north of Canada, I mean, that would save a huge amount of journey time. Cook was unsuccessful in his attempt, but efforts continued right through until the middle of the 19th century. And most famously, I suppose, with John Franklin's ill-fated mission, which you could now watch in melodramatic horror as The Terror on BBC television at the moment. I mean, the individuals may be right, but most of the facts, I think, have been altered. But yeah, so that route was still being looked for, and of course, as a result of climate change and global warming, it's now essentially something that can begin to be used in a way that was essentially impossible before.
Thank you, Robert. That's great. Ballast. I want to get on to that with you, Louise, because when I talked to you before, talked to both of you, you mentioned about which I thought was interesting because of how it was used on the clipper ships. Could you tell us a bit about the ballast?
Yeah. Tea is obviously a relatively light product, and ballast for ships is all about making the ship steady in the sea. So you have to have something to do that, to weigh it down effectively. And it makes a lot of sense to have a ballast that you can actually sell. If you're just using pebbles or whatever, this is not a commodity that can be passed on. So a lot of ships began to sell porcelain. So of course, as with the popularity of tea grew, with it, this interest in this sort of exotic and delicate paraphernalia came with it. Porcelain was, of course, a way to show off and to present your status, as it were. So it became incredibly popular, was copied over here. Robert, I think, knows a lot more about that than I do. But the porcelain was used as ballast, so it would use potentially at the bottom of the ship so that the tea could be kept on top and ensure that it was dry, and this meant that therefore you had two products that you could go home and sell.
Right, yes, come back to the porcelain and the rise of pottery and porcelain in the UK due to the popularity of tea. How did that begin? Like, Robert, you told me a couple of really good stories about the Chinese painting them and being sent over and back. So if you could.
Yeah, so Louise is absolutely right. The sort of paraphernalia of tea becomes very popular, as does porcelain itself, because it's much finer than anything Europe had to offer at the time. So in the early 18th century, you might decide, because you have been knighted or raised to the peerage because you are so absolutely wonderful, and you've been given a new coat of arms, that you will, what you'll want is an armorial dinner service to enormously impress impress all your new friends. So you will get a picture of your new coat of arms, and that will be sent to China with the order for the armorial dinner service. And so Chinese artists will then copy that design onto, you know, the plates, the tureens, the bowls, everything that you need. Now, obviously, because that's being done by many artists who may have only had a quick look at the armorial, you begin to get little errors that creep in. Often the Latin motto gets badly mangled by the Chinese artist, sometimes with quite amusing effects. So you come back with a motto that doesn't really do the family proud, or there will be improvisation. So you might have armorial bearers at the side, figures that are supporting your crest. Well, they might begin to look increasingly Chinese as the artist begins to work on. So when eventually, you know, after a few years, your service is shipped back to Britain, you might get, well, a slight surprise, you know, and you might keep quite a lot of gravy on the plate to perhaps disguise what the motto means.
Yeah.
The other thing that happens, of course, is that eventually British potters like Wedgwood master the making of porcelain themselves. So what they're able to do is to begin to copy Chinese designs and adapt them for domestic British use.
Okay.
But at the same time, they actually begin to export tea pots to China, which seems extraordinary. I mean, it's the sort of ultimate calls to Newcastle, exactly.
Yeah. Brilliant. So coffee houses were already established here. People already drank coffee. And then I think the first one was in 1652, the first coffee house, but tea was still, when it was still a rare curiosity. It said Catherine of Braganza was instrumental to introducing tea to Britain. So what can you tell us about this lady?
Well, I mean, Catherine of Braganza was betrothed to Charles II. So she arrived at Portsmouth in 1662 to marry the king. And I think she'd had a rough time in the English Channel and, you know, had certainly not found her sea legs. So when she sort of staggered ashore in Portsmouth, she asked for a cup of tea as refreshment. And I understand that she was promptly given a pint of beer instead. So you know, the Hampshire of the 1660s had not quite reached the levels of the Portuguese court in terms of its cultivation. I'm going to get complaints from Hampshire now. But what I think it's quite interesting that tea becomes a sort of fairly domestic and feminine drink, something that ladies can take in the parlour without the need for servants to be present, whereas coffee remains a quite sort of public and masculine thing that's dealt with through coffee houses and tends to be male.
Right. I asked you about that. So, so the popularity of tea grew rapidly in like 1700s, and then it was I think available in over 50 coffee houses and was said to have medicinal qualities. What were these qualities? And I think we have a picture as well, Shahira, a slide, at least an image to show some people taking it. But yeah, what were the medicinal qualities of the tea supposed to be, or reckoned to? Yeah, just back again one. This was a tea house, but yeah, there's the tea making outside Greenwich Hospital.
There had been lots of complaints about coffee, and there are sort of two forms of complaint because it's public and male. Sort of coffee and tobacco were seen together, and coffee was said to be very drying. In other words, you had your cup of coffee and it had a sort of diuretic effect.
Yeah.
Tea, on the other hand, was meant to be calming. So, in other words, coffee was seen as a stimulant. Now, we now know, of course, that tea and coffee both have caffeine in them, but it was felt that the way tea was taken and the circumstances made it a much more calming drink.
Yeah. I mean, I know just from personal experience, if I'm like when I've been feeling really sick, I would never have coffee, and I love coffee, but it's like it never appeals to me. It's just too much. But tea, you can always have.
Well, I mean, I'm fond of saying that no problem is worse after a hot bath or a cup of tea. So, so I think that perhaps holds true.
We did touch on last week with Katie about the difference between afternoon tea and high tea, and she briefly mentioned the Duchess of Bedford. Can you throw some light on that for us? Duchess of Bedford?
Well, if I remember, and Louise, you may know more about this than I do, is that what happened in the the 18th and 19th century is that the gap between lunch and dinner kept getting longer, because dinner became the principal meal of the day and began to be taken later and later and later in the day. So if you had your lunch at, I don't know, noon or 1, and dinner wasn't being served until 8, well, I think by that time the Duchess of Bedford was suffering from, a rumbly tumbly, and she needed something, a bit of sandwich, a bit of cake, a scone, whatever, just to see her through until dinner finally appeared. So I think that's the sort of positioning of tea at 4 sort of arrives at.
Do either of you have any idea where the phrase "not my cup of tea" originates from? Just throwing that in there, maybe not.
No, I mean, I don't know if Robert does. I mean, I a sort of cursory internet browse suggested that always the first port of call.
Yeah.
What do we do about Mr. Google? I don't know. Suggested to me, and it might be completely wrong, that from its early popularity in Britain, the positive version of the phrase "that's my cup of tea" was used fairly frequently and from fairly early on. The negative version seems to have been, I don't know if this is true, seems to have been attributed to Nancy Mitford in the 1920s, 1930s. But again, Robert may know far more.
Thank you.
No, I think we've both looked at the same website. Yeah, I think that's right. It starts as a positive and then is twisted to be, a negative.
Negative. Great. Louise, if I could just go back to, because we have the very beautiful Cutty Sark in Greenwich, and I wanted to ask you a couple of things about that, because it's I'm not sure if it's actually open at the moment, but it's very well visited. And I just wondered first, what are the most common questions that you get about the Cutty Sark?
It's not open at the moment, just to throw that one in there. It will be open from the 17th of May. So, keep that in your diaries, everyone. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most common questions is whether we can confirm whether somebody's ancestor has served on Cutty Sark. More often than not, sadly, we have to say no. We have the crew lists for the ship's years as a British ship. It also served as a Portuguese ship. We don't so much have those crew lists, but I think it goes hand in hand with the ship's fame, and it's maybe misremembering, and maybe a little bit of Chinese whispers, and suddenly something becomes family legend. A grandfather might have suggested that they served with somebody who served on Cutty Sark, and in someone's mind that becomes he served on, and so on. So I think with anything that's famous, we all want to have a link, and I think that's completely reasonable. So I think that's one of our most popular commonly asked questions, whether we can confirm whether a relative has served on board. And
sorry, just before you go on, do you have a record of everybody who served on it?
In the ship's British years, yes, we do.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, it's possible, because there are certain anecdotal episodes. It's possible that there are stowaways or certain crew members who weren't listed, so it might not be 100% accurate. There's also always a possibility that names have been misspelt. Very often on crew lists, you have to name a place of origin. Some people will have named their place of origin as the place they were born. Others will have named it as the last port they were in. Right. So there's always room for a bit of confusion and a bit of debate. But we do have those records, and they provide fantastic information for us. We also have, which some of our listeners might be familiar with, the ship's longest serving and most successful master, Captain Woodgett. He took up photography actually while he was serving on Cutty Sark, and his photographs provide just invaluable record of what life on board would have been like. But that's another sort of avenue of questions. When you see these individuals, sometimes visitors ask, I think that could be my relative, can we possibly explore that? So that's that's another question. But I think it speaks volumes of how emotive and how emotional our connection to Cutty Sark is, because we all want to have some sort of connection, like I said.
And any other sort of questions that pop to your head that regularly get asked about the Cutty Sark besides the crew?
Well, one that crops up, it's cropping up less and less. So again, our listeners might I'm sure they'll be familiar with the fire that occurred in 2007. And as that starts to fade from memory, so too do questions about it. But initially, I think, especially when you go and visit Cutty Sark, you see that she looks absolutely beautiful. I'm not supposed to be she. I can't get out of that habit, sort of calling the ship she. You can the ship looks beautiful. It doesn't look damaged. So a lot of people have asked us in the past, or have assumed, that the ship is actually a replica, and that the fire that we saw and the flames raging through all three decks actually completely destroyed the ship, which isn't the case actually. It didn't. The ship has a kind of a real habit of being a lucky survivor, a kind of manages to escape at the last minute. And what happened in terms of the fire was that the year before, a conservation project had begun. So the ship was stripped of its original material, and actually it has a fair amount of original material. The whole structure is believed to be about 90% original to 1869, which is pretty phenomenal for any ship, let alone one that's 151 years old. But that original fabric was stripped and sent elsewhere. So when the fire struck, although it was devastating and destroyed material that no one was intending to replace, in terms of that original material, it was nowhere near as bad as it could have been. So it was one of Cutty Sark's many lucky escapes. But yes, that's a question that is often asked about how real is Cutty Sark?
Okay, I'm aware that we don't have loads of time left. I'm not sure if we, I know there's another question. Let me have a look. Fascinating talk. Thank you, Kim. How long did it typically take the Cutty Sark to sail from China to England?
Typically about, it can be very different. Let's say about 110 days. That's a kind of typical voyage. Although Cutty Sark, as we all know, is a very famous ship built exclusively for the China tea trade, she didn't actually do that well in that trade. She only actually had 8 voyages in that trade, and it's actually as an Australian wool clipper. We don't have time to go into that now, unfortunately, but it's actually in that trade that the ship forged its reputation as one of the fastest afloat.
Oh, wow. Okay. New to me as well. I'm getting lots of great information here. Just a couple of things. One to you, Louise. If like in a short bite-sized piece, sorry, life on board for those for the crew. Would it been very difficult? Was
Yes,
yeah.
absolutely. Typically, Cutty Sark would have a crew of about 28 men. So that's really not very many for. I mean, Cutty Sark isn't a huge ship, but 28 men is not a large contingent. They would spend the vast majority of their time on the main deck. Very rarely go below. There was no real need for them to go below. They'd work, sleep, and eat on the main deck. There's 2 deck houses where they would sleep. And they would work on a watch system of 4 hours on, 4 hours off, unless there was some sort of emergency which would necessitate the all hands on deck call, in which case sleep goes out the window and you need to get back on deck. Yeah, and it would have been incredibly tough. What kind of jobs you were given would depend on your rank, but it would have been a lot of repairing, a lot of controlling of the sails, and repairing those as well, because of course if the ship is left damaged, damage can grow, and that threatens not just the ship's safety but your own safety as a member of the crew.
Cool.
That
You know, that's a, I know, bite-sized piece, but you did a great job on that. Thank you. I'm just thinking as well, like, were they paid well or not? I mean, I guess it
not
depends.
very.
Not very for that kind of work.
It absolutely depends on the rank. Yes, yeah. I mean, it's estimated that a master could receive about £200 a year, so that's the captain of the ship, and that's a decent wage. For the common roles such as an able seaman, they wouldn't earn a great deal, but they would be paid at the end of their voyage. Well, they tended to be paid at the end of the voyage. So you'd sign up in London, do the whole voyage all the way back to London, and then be paid. So there was less opportunity to spend your money. You're on a ship for months on end. So there's, again, less need to spend money. So there's a way of saving some money. And there was also the possibility, particularly for officers, to allot some of that money to wives. But no, it wasn't massively lucrative for the average sailor.
Right. Back to you, Robert. Last question, really, I guess, from me. Tea gardens. Do you know when they sprung up, or do you?
I'm not sure if I do.
Okay.
You know, I mean, public gardens with the taking of tea. I mean, probably around since the 18th century. You know,
Right.
you could have visited a pleasure garden, and tea would almost certainly have been available.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the sort of British love affair with tea means that you can try and take tea in almost any circumstance. You know, so tea will travel with the British wherever they are going. You know, so Captain Scott at the South Pole is having a cup of tea. Doubtless British astronauts have complained about the quality of tea in orbit. I can guarantee it.
Most probably. There was a link as well between the temperance movement and tea. Was that because tea was seen as a lady's drink, or not as strong as coffee?
Well, no, tea was seen as a very viable alternative to alcohol. And tea also, of course, had, in the 19th century, a broader public health benefit, in that, of course, you've got to boil your water to make tea. Right. And, if you were taking, a glass of London water in the 1820s, I mean, you were probably taking your life into your own hands. If, however, you boiled it to make tea, you had probably killed off the thing that was likely to kill you. So actually, tea advances public health.
Right. Guys, listen, thank you so much. I know you've got so much knowledge in there, and there's plenty more, but we're cut off by the time. Thanks for doing this. And I'd also like to say thank you to Shahira as well for manning the Zoom and doing all that good business, letting you all in. We have next week, Saren, I've forgotten the name. I know I've got it up in the last slide, but she is going to come and tell us lots of really interesting things. She's a food historian, so she knows her stuff, and let's hope you come back and see us then. But for this evening, I would really like to thank Robert and Louise for sharing all your tea stories with us, and thank you for joining in.
Thank you, Elma.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Cheers.